is still a profoundly moving statement of our values, and it has never been more relevant than it is now.
5 minutes ago, Buckingham Palace fell silent as King Charles stepped before the cameras, his face solemn, his hands clasped over a folder bearing the royal crest. In a voice steadier than the moment deserved, he delivered words that will echo through royal history. "It is with deep regret and duty that I confirm the permanent withdrawal of my brother, the Duke of York, from public life." The statement lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it carried the weight of a dynasty confronting its own reflection. For those watching, the scene was haunting. The king stood in the white drawing room, beneath chandeliers that once sparkled above his mother's Christmas broadcasts. The glint of the crown displayed behind him caught the light, a reminder that monarchy endures even as family bonds fracture. I'll confess, seeing that golden reflection on the glass of the camera lens felt symbolic duty shining through heartbreak. Outside the palace gates, London paused. Tourists lowered their phones. The news ticker on every screen flashed the same line: King Charles announces tragic royal decision. Inside, aides whispered that the timing, 12 October 2025, had been chosen carefully. It fell just days after the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's first televised address in 1957, a deliberate nod to continuity amid upheaval. Even in sorrow, the crown was telling a story about survival. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, at Royal Lodge in Windsor, Prince Andrew reportedly watched the broadcast in silence. For him, those 2 minutes marked not just the end of a career, but the quiet erasure of a lifetime beneath the royal seal. As the king's words faded and cameras clicked like distant thunder, one truth became impossible to ignore: mercy and monarchy rarely share the same throne. Stay with me until the end, because what led to this painful announcement, the secret letters, the sleepless nights, and the single act of loyalty that sealed Andrew's fate, reveals a side of King Charles the world has never truly seen. To understand how this announcement came to pass, we have to return to the quieter corridors of Buckingham months before October 2025. Behind the marble and mirrors, the palace had the stillness of a storm about to break. Courtiers moved in measured silence, sensing that something irrevocable was approaching. Prince Andrew's name had vanished from briefings, yet his absence filled every conversation. At Royal Lodge, Windsor's autumn light poured through long windows onto dust-covered portraits. Andrew, once the daring helicopter pilot who flew rescue missions in the Falklands, now lived surrounded by reminders of relevance lost. His aides described him walking the gardens alone at dusk, tracing the same path toward the deer fences, as if he could still patrol borders no one asked him to defend. I sometimes think of that image, a man trapped inside heritage, as the truest portrait of decline. For King Charles, the dilemma was both constitutional and human. Since ascending the throne in 2023, he had sworn to rebuild the crown's credibility after decades of scandal. Yet how do you rebuild by dismantling blood? The Newsnight interview of 2019 still echoed across every meeting with advisors. Sponsors had withdrawn, veterans groups had distanced themselves, and even the Church of England had urged moral clarity. The king knew what that meant. Duty had to triumph over sentiment. Camilla urged compassion, reminding him that mercy was part of legacy too. Anne countered with the sharp truth that public faith, once lost, is never regained. Between those voices, Charles found no comfort, only the steady thrum of inevitability. "If the crown falters," Anne said one night, "we all fall with it." Through summer, memos thickened, schedules changed, and Andrew's photograph quietly disappeared from palace corridors. The institution was editing its own memory, line by line. When the king finally took up his pen, he wasn't writing a punishment, he was writing preservation. Because monarchy, for all its grandeur, survives on one fragile currency: trust. And trust, once cracked, cannot be polished back to perfection. By early October, the king understood what had to be done. The decision was sealed not in anger, but in grief, a brother's final duty to the legacy of his crown. The first hints that something was shifting came not through headlines or whispers, but through absences, empty spaces where a name used to be. In early September 2025, invitations for the annual Remembrance Banquet were distributed to senior members of the royal family. For years, even in disgrace, Prince Andrew's name had been included quietly among the extended Windsor list. This time, it was gone. No announcement, no explanation. Within palace circles, that omission spoke louder than any decree. At Royal Lodge, Andrew noticed other changes. The regular deliveries of palace correspondence, those thick folders embossed with the royal cipher, simply stopped arriving. The silence from Buckingham was clinical, not cruel. When he inquired, aides replied that His Majesty's office is streamlining communication. It was a phrase crafted to soothe, yet everyone knew what it meant. The connection between the king and his brother was being reduced to ceremony. Still, Andrew tried to keep a semblance of purpose. He drafted letters to charities he once supported, suggesting that he might return in a quiet, non-official capacity. One draft, later leaked to a tabloid, included the line, "I wish to continue serving, if only in the smallest way." The public reaction was swift and devastating. An online poll by The Times showed that 73% of respondents believed any return would damage the monarchy's credibility. For a man who once represented royal vigor, that number might as well have been a verdict. Inside Buckingham, the tone toward Andrew's situation was shifting from discussion to finalization. King Charles, usually reflective in decision-making, had begun holding shorter, firmer meetings with his senior advisors. Witnesses described him as measured but resolved. One aide told the Telegraph that His Majesty seemed deeply pained, but he'd crossed an invisible line. It was no longer a question of if, but how. Among those advisors, Princess Anne played an essential role. Her voice carried weight not through sentiment but through blunt precision. "We can't build continuity on cracks," she told the king during one late meeting at St. James's Palace. Charles didn't answer immediately. He simply looked toward the window, where the reflection of the crown displayed in the corridor's glass case shimmered faintly in the lamplight. The symbolism was unmissable, the weight of the monarchy watching him even when no one spoke. Across London, reporters began noticing subtle shifts too. Press officers who once fielded questions about Andrew now deflected them altogether. The palace PR machine had turned opaque, the surest sign of brewing change. Journalists compared notes over late-night drinks, noting that certain words, rehabilitation, representation, return, were suddenly off-limits. At Clarence House, Camilla observed her husband's unease grow. She reportedly told a confidant that Charles slept little and spent long evenings rereading the Queen's old speeches, particularly one from 1992, when Elizabeth had described her own annus horribilis, "No institution, city, or human being can exist without adversity." The phrase lingered in his mind. For Charles, adversity now wore his brother's face. Meanwhile, Andrew's daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, remained publicly silent. Privately, however, they were said to have pleaded for gentleness. "He's accepted his mistakes," Beatrice told one family friend, "but he doesn't deserve to be erased." The king listened, but even compassion has its limits when weighed against centuries of precedent. By late September, the final signals were impossible to ignore. Andrew's photograph was quietly removed from a public corridor in Buckingham's East Wing, a gallery once dedicated to royal service. The space it left behind, an elegant oval frame, now holding a neutral landscape, felt like an intentional metaphor. When asked about the change, a palace staffer shrugged. "It's a rotation, not a removal." But in a family where every gesture carries meaning, that subtle rotation was a silent declaration. And then came the leaks. The press began murmuring about a confidential document titled "Continuity Note, Private Role Adjustment, Duke of York." No one outside the inner circle had seen it, but excerpts began appearing online, phrases like "permanent withdrawal," "legacy management," and "with familial compassion." Each leak drew more attention, forcing Buckingham into the same paradox it always faces. The harder it tries to stay silent, the louder the silence becomes. Through it all, the king's composure never faltered publicly. At engagements, he smiled for cameras, shook hands, and spoke warmly about heritage preservation and climate projects. Yet those close to him saw the strain. One courtier recalled entering Charles's study one evening to find him staring at the imperial state crown on its stand, lost in thought. "It is both a burden and a promise," he murmured. "And both come with a price." That price, as everyone within the palace now knew, was Andrew's final departure from public life. The quiet omissions had become unmistakable signs of an approaching reckoning. What had once been whispered in strategy sessions was now a countdown measured not in words but in silences. In the world of royalty, endings are never sudden, they unfold like dusk, one shadow at a time. By the time October approached, the night had already begun to fall for the Duke of York. The meeting that sealed Prince Andrew's fate began not with ceremony but with the muted click of a door closing inside St. James's Palace. The air in the council chamber was heavy, perfumed faintly with old wood and polished brass. The portraits of past monarchs seemed to lean closer, as though eager to witness another royal reckoning. Around the table sat a small circle of the king's most trusted figures: Princess Anne, Prince William, the Lord Chamberlain, and Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary. The agenda bore a simple heading: Continuity Planning. Duke of York. King Charles entered last. He paused for a moment beneath the portrait of his late mother before taking his seat. The silence that followed carried the weight of 50 years of duty and guilt. "Let's proceed," he said quietly. The words were calm, but those who knew him could hear the fatigue beneath the control. It was Sir Clive who spoke first, summarizing the discussions that had been unfolding in confidential memos for weeks. "Your Majesty, the consensus is clear. The Duke's continued presence, even in a private role, presents reputational risk. The institution cannot afford ambiguity." Charles nodded, his eyes fixed on the paper before him. He knew the language of bureaucratic exile well. It was the same tone that had once been used to protect him during his own turbulent years as Prince of Wales. Anne's voice broke the stillness. "We've tried silence, Charles. It hasn't worked. The press interprets quiet as weakness." She placed a folder on the table. Inside were tabloid clippings, each headline more merciless than the last. "If we wait any longer, the story writes itself and we lose control of it." William, seated opposite his father, said little. His expression was measured, but his presence alone carried authority. He had lived through his mother's public unraveling, and he understood better than anyone how unchecked scandal corrodes public trust. When he finally spoke, it was with reluctant certainty. "The monarchy survives by continuity, not sentiment. Uncle Andrew's chapter is closed, but it hasn't been signed off." Charles turned to look at him, and for a fleeting moment, the room seemed to shrink. Here was the paradox of fatherhood and kingship, colliding, the heir advising the sovereign, the son reminding the father of his own duty. Camilla was not in the room, but her influence lingered. Earlier that morning, she had left a handwritten note on Charles's desk. "Do what must be done, but let it be remembered as compassion, not punishment." He kept that note folded inside his jacket pocket, touching it occasionally as though to remind himself that mercy still had a place in monarchy. The debate stretched for nearly 2 hours. They discussed logistics, phrasing, and optics. Sir Clive proposed that the announcement be delivered from the White Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace, a setting of continuity and dignity. "It frames the king as the custodian of heritage," he explained. "The public must see that this is not vengeance, it is stewardship." Anne agreed, though her gaze remained fixed on the table. "Then make it clean. We've let too many wounds linger." Eventually, Charles rose and walked toward the tall window overlooking the mall. Outside, the rain streaked the glass, blurring the city beyond. "I have loved him," he said softly, "but love does not absolve consequence." The others said nothing. The ticking of the clock filled the room like a heartbeat. Later that evening, in Clarence House, the king sat alone at his desk. Before him lay the final draft of the statement, printed on thick cream stationery and topped with the royal crest. He read it twice, lips moving faintly with the words. Then he reached for his fountain pen, the same one used to sign his accession documents in 2022, and signed beneath the closing line. "With compassion, but in recognition of duty." When the ink dried, The page glowed faintly in the lamplight, a quiet testament to a monarchy forever balancing mercy against survival. Elsewhere, word of the coming decision began to ripple through the inner circles. Courtiers exchanged glances in corridors. Journalists noticed an unusual tightening of palace schedules. At Windsor, Andrew's security detail was instructed to expect increased media presence within the week. The inevitability of change was sinking in, and yet, even as the machinery of duty turned, a faint undertone of sorrow persisted. One staff member recalled hearing the king humming under his breath as he reviewed the speech late that night, a fragment of an old hymn once sung at his mother's coronation. The things which are seen are temporal, the things which are unseen are eternal. By the following dawn, every line of the statement had been rehearsed, every camera angle adjusted, every silence accounted for. The crown, that enduring emblem of stability, was once again preparing to shed a piece of itself. When Charles finally looked into the mirror before leaving his study, he saw not a monarch triumphant, but a man aged by the necessity of consequence. He straightened his tie, touched the folded note from Camilla, and whispered the words his mother had once told him. "The crown is not worn, it is carried." Then, without another word, he stepped toward the duty that awaited him, one that would end a brother's chapter and redefine a reign. On the morning of 12 October 2025, the gates of Buckingham Palace opened to a grey London sky. The air was heavy, the kind of damp chill that clings to the city before a storm. Inside, the white drawing room gleamed under stage lights, transformed overnight into a solemn broadcast chamber. The royal crest stood behind a polished lectern. The imperial state crown rested nearby in its glass case, catching glints of gold beneath the chandeliers. It was there that King Charles, after weeks of sleepless deliberation, faced the world. When he appeared, there was no fanfare, only silence thick enough to hear the faint hum of the cameras. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice measured, almost fatherly, "it is my duty to confirm that my brother, the Duke of York, will permanently withdraw from all royal and public engagements. This decision has been reached with mutual understanding and compassion, in the spirit of service and continuity that defines our family's legacy." Each phrase fell like a bell toll. Reporters would later describe it as the speech that ended a bloodline within the bloodline. And while it lasted barely 2 minutes, its aftershock rippled across the nation. Within minutes, major outlets from the BBC to the New York Times flashed the headline, "King Charles makes tragic royal announcement." Crowds began forming outside the palace, umbrellas blooming in the drizzle. Some bowed their heads in silence. Others pressed their phones to the gates, recording history through streaks of rain. In pubs from Manchester to Edinburgh, televisions replayed the broadcast on loop. A royal correspondent on Sky News called it, "a farewell wrapped in restraint." I can still remember that sound, the faint echo of applause, when the king stepped away from the lectern, not out of triumph, but of respect. Behind him, aides began packing away cables and cue cards. The room smelled faintly of wax and anxiety. Charles stood still for a moment longer, his reflection overlapping with the gleaming crown in its case. Duty and heritage, side by side, but forever divided by glass. Outside, the digital tides surged. The hashtag number "farewell to the Duke" climbed to #1 within an hour. On Google Trends, searches for Prince Andrew spiked by 400%, while King Charles' speech briefly overtook football in national interest. It wasn't scandal this time, it was closure that fascinated people. At Royal Lodge, Prince Andrew watched in silence, seated in the same armchair where he had once received dispatches from his mother. The television's glow washed over his face, the rain outside tapping softly on the window panes. When the king spoke the words, "permanently withdraw," Andrew exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if a verdict long expected had finally been read aloud. An aide who stood nearby later said, "He didn't flinch. He just said, 'He's right.'" Meanwhile, at Clarence House, Camilla monitored the reaction with quiet precision. "He did what only a monarch could do," she murmured to an advisor. "He carried the weight and kept the grace." The comment would leak to the press later, fueling admiration for the Queen Consort's composure amid turmoil. In the global press, the announcement drew a strange mixture of grief and respect. French commentators called it La Monarchie du Devoir, the monarchy of duty. American anchors described it as a human act from an inhuman institution. In Sydney, early morning commuters stopped before cafe screens to watch replayed clips subtitled with the line, "A king protects the crown, even from his own." For the king himself, the hardest moment came not before the cameras but after them. When the crew dismantled the set and silence reclaimed the room, he walked toward the glass case holding the crown. For a long while, he studied its reflection, the jewels flashing faintly like captured stars. "Every generation pays a different price for it," he said softly, to no one in particular. That night, Buckingham's lights burned late. Outside, the rain turned to fog, blurring the outlines of the palace gates. Inside, Charles sat at his desk with the signed statement beside him, its ink now dry, its meaning irreversible. He poured a small glass of water, not wine, and whispered, "May history be kinder to him than the present." It was a moment that would be remembered not for scandal or spectacle, but for sorrow, the quiet triumph of duty over affection. And though the speech was over, its echo would follow the monarchy for years, reminding the world that crowns gleam brightest against the darkness of sacrifice. In the days that followed the king's announcement, Britain moved through a strange calm, the kind that comes after thunder. The palace gates, once crowded with cameras and murmuring tourists, stood under a pale October light. Yet behind that stillness, ripples of consequence spread through every corner of royal life. What had been declared as a private transition became in effect a redefinition of monarchy itself. Public reaction was measured but firm. A YouGov poll released 2 days later showed 68% of Britons agreeing that the decision had been necessary to protect the crown's reputation. Newspapers called it a clean incision in a festering wound. For older generations, it echoed Elizabeth II's steadfast discipline. For younger ones, it symbolized accountability at last. I remember thinking that no institution so steeped in tradition had managed to modernize simply by speaking the word enough. The ripple reached beyond Britain's shores. The New York Times praised Charles's restraint, calling it the act of a monarch choosing legacy over loyalty. France's Le Monde described it as le poids du devoir, the weight of duty. In Australia, commentators debated whether the decision proved monarchy could still act with moral authority, or if it merely exposed how human it had become. The global fascination was undeniable. Even nations once indifferent to royal affairs tuned in to watch a family balancing survival against sentiment. Inside Buckingham Palace, the consequences were quieter but heavier. Courtiers spoke of the king's demeanor softening and hardening in the same breath. He fulfilled engagements with renewed precision, yet those who worked near him noticed a new stillness when Andrew's name surfaced. At dinner, aides said, he rarely finished his glass of claret. Duty had restored stability, but at the cost of peace. Meanwhile, at Royal Lodge, Andrew's life settled into a melancholy rhythm. The press eventually drifted away, leaving behind only the whir of occasional drone cameras above Windsor's treetops. Friends described him as subdued but lucid, tending to the gardens and rereading old naval memoirs. "He's not bitter," one confidant told the Telegraph. "He's resigned like a man who finally understands his chapter has closed." The quote resonated across headlines for days, turning pity into a kind of national catharsis. The family itself adapted with quiet choreography. William and Catherine resumed duties across the Commonwealth. Their composure was hailed as the monarchy's bridge to tomorrow. Anne, though unflinching, was said to have visited Andrew privately, leaving without cameras or escort. Camilla organized new charitable programs under the theme of resilience through service, subtly aligning public goodwill back toward the palace. Yet the emotional residue remained. Late one evening, a courtier entered the king's study to find him standing before the crown display again, the jewels glinting under soft lamplight. "It is not the weight of the crown that tires me," Charles murmured. "It's the ghosts beneath it." Those words were never meant for publication, but they circulated quietly among staff, a human confession from a man who had been both brother and judge. For the monarchy, the fallout became its proof of endurance. Public trust stabilized, sponsors returned, and the crown's brand heritage, continuity, service regained its gleam. Yet for the family behind the facade, the cost lingered in silence. Charles had secured the institution, but in doing so, he had exiled a piece of himself. History would call it prudence. Those who lived it called it loss. And as autumn deepened over Windsor's gray skies, the monarchy stood steadier, colder, and lonelier, its duty fulfilled, its heart a little dimmer than before. As dusk settled over London, Buckingham Palace stood bathed in amber light. The glass case that held the imperial state crown shimmered faintly, each gem reflecting the glow of history and of consequence. Inside the palace, King Charles sat alone in his study, the same desk where he had once signed the document that ended his brother's public life. The ink had long since dried, but its shadow lingered across every corridor of Windsor and Buckingham alike. Outside, the autumn air carried the faint toll of church bells from Westminster. The sound drifted through the open window, mingling with the rustle of papers on the king's desk. On one of those pages lay a handwritten letter, unsigned and undated. Its opening line read, "Forgiveness, too, is an act of duty." No one knew if he ever sent it, but those words captured the paradox of a ruler forced to choose between justice and mercy. At Royal Lodge, Prince Andrew's house glowed softly under the October moon. His world had become smaller but quieter. He tended to the grounds himself now, pruning roses near the fountain, the same way his mother once did at Balmoral. A neighbor claimed to have seen him place a small Union Jack beside a bench overlooking the park. Whether it was an act of remembrance or redemption, no one could say. Yet perhaps that small gesture spoke louder than any public apology ever could. There was something profoundly human in that image, a man stripped of titles, yet still bound to the soil of his family's history. And maybe that is the real lesson hidden in this royal tragedy, that dignity is not found in crowns or titles, but in accepting consequence with grace. The monarchy, for all its grandeur, is a mirror of the people it serves, flawed, vulnerable, and learning. Again and again, that legacy demands honesty. As King Charles closed the window and extinguished the lamp, he whispered a line once spoken by his mother, "To serve is to be tested." In that quiet room, those words became both benediction and burden, the final prayer of a monarch who had chosen truth over comfort. For us, watching from across the world, this story is more than a royal headline. It's a reminder that responsibility often comes dressed as loss. Every family, every institution, faces moments when it must decide what to preserve and what to let go. And in those moments, compassion and courage are not opposites, they are two sides of integrity. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on its meaning. Give this video a like if you believe accountability and forgiveness can coexist. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the king's decision was mercy or justice disguised in duty? And let us know where in the world you're watching, from London, Manila, Toronto, or somewhere far from Windsor's mist. And above all, don't forget to subscribe to stay with us as we uncover the next chapter in the ever-unfolding story of Britain's royal family, where every jewel tells a history and every decision carries the weight of a crown.